everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Alex Peck, and I am the program's committee co-chair here at GYOPO. Just quick housekeeping. If you want to sign up for our mailing list, you can sign up at the front there. If you want to volunteer, you can also sign up for that. We're a volunteer-run organization, so it's only through all of our shared labor that we're able to sort of make these public and free programs for the community. Tonight we gather kind of with a heavy heart as we've been processing what's going on in Gaza and Israel, and as we kind of recognize the impact on community members here in the U.S. as well. We can hold space for all suffering of Israeli families taken hostage by Hamas, of Palestinians losing their lives, homes, and families due to the genocide happening in Gaza right now, and of the backlash and scapegoating happening here in the U.S., targeting Jews, Palestinians, and Muslims, most recently including the recent murder of Wadea Al-Fayoum, a 6-year-old Palestinian boy who was murdered in his own home in Chicago. So please join me in a moment of silence right now, just to kind of recognize all the suffering right now. Thanks, everyone. It's important for us to gather here today so that we can all kind of recommit ourselves to social change and to figure out how we can play a role in supporting the various ecosystems and communities that we are connected to. So I'm thrilled to introduce Deepa Iyer, author of Social Change Now, and Cathi Choi, who most of you know, who is Director of Policy and Organizing for Women Across DMZ, and also co-coordinator of the Career Peace Now Grassroots Network, and also Programs Committee Co-Chair here at GYOPO. So I'd like to jump right into the conversation and start learning from these two brilliant women. So if you'd like to find out more about them, please refer to the bios on the website. Y'all can read it by yourselves and figure out everything they've done. And I'm going to hand it over to Deepa, who's going to read a little bit from her book, of which we have a few copies available for sale, by the way, in the back. And then I'll sort of moderate a short discussion between Cathi and Deepa, and then we'll kind of open it up for Q&A. And then after that, Deepa's going to lead us through a sort of interactive workshop and exercises to sort of reflect on this framework and sort of help us to have some time to process and think about where we can be connected in it. And then we'll conclude with some group reflection, and then of course we'll have some yummy food together, as is GYOPO custom. So please join me in welcoming Deepa and
Thank you so much, Alex. And thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to the GYOPO team of volunteers, Cathi, for making this event tonight possible. It's really great to be in community with you. As Alex said, it's been a really heavy week, I think, for everyone. And being in community, I think, is a balm. Most of my work actually began in the wake of September 11th, and so for me, my political home and my community home is really with Muslim, Arab, Sikh, and South Asian community members. And a lot of even what you are going to hear today comes from the work of those communities, as well as Black liberation movements, the work of undocumented migrants, and cross-racial solidarity. So hopefully you'll see and hear a lot of those echoes. This framework is a really humble offering on my part. My intention is that this framework can just buttress the work that you all are already engaged in or want to do. So I want to start by just reading you a little bit just to set some context. And then most importantly, we're going to be in conversation, and you'll hopefully have a chance to ask your own questions as well. Okay. Not yet. We have a plan. Okay. All right. There is a story that has always stayed with me about Grace Lee Boggs, a Detroit-based Asian American activist and scholar. At the start of community meetings, Grace would begin with a question. What time is it on the clock of the world, she would ask. When I reflect on that question, I often have the palpable and sometimes urgent feeling that the time is ripe, the time is now, and the time is immediate for social change. We're living through a time that demands our attention and requires our consistent action. People around the world are confronting wars, climate disasters, and economic inequity at unprecedented levels. Here in the United States, we face an almost daily barrage of attacks and restrictions on the rights, bodies, and livelihoods of people. The violent insurrection at the US Capitol in 2021 came on the heels of a polarizing presidential election that followed 4 years of bans, walls, and raids against communities. The global pandemic has exposed the weaknesses of public systems and institutions that we have long relied upon, from education to housing to public health. The visible presence of white nationalist groups is spurring fear. Transgender youth feel unsafe in schools and on streets, and climate change is a continual threat to everyone on our planet. All of these overlapping crises stem from similar root causes: anti-Black racism, imperialism and colonialism, extractive capitalist models, and histories of oppressive treatment towards communities. But people over generations have been addressing and eliminating many of these root causes, and yet there is still so much work to be done. I'm often reminded of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s quote about the urgency of now, a phrase that is in conversation with Grace Lee Boggs' question about the time on the clock of the world. Dr. King in 1967 said, "We are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late." How can each of us contend with the urgency of this time with effectiveness, sustainability, and strong connections? And how can we embody grace, joy, and accountability, even when the external forces of division and inequity are relentless? In workshops and trainings that I conduct with people of diverse ages and backgrounds on this framework, I often ask people to reflect on their state of readiness to engage with the issues facing society today. The responses are very similar and usually include the following. We feel overwhelmed, frustrated, and confused. We find ourselves on a seesaw, lurching between numbness and outrage. The ways that we have always responded are no longer sufficient or effective. We're not sure what to say or how to step in. We expect more from our organizations and community leaders, but feel disappointed and heartbroken at times. Or maybe that resonates, some of that. But I also hear more. Even as people bear weary witness to the emergencies and crises swirling around them, they're connecting and they're learning. People are aligning around their shared values and goals, recognizing that entrenched power structures and inequitable systems can no longer be part of the status quo. More and more of us are acutely realizing that issues of justice, equality, and solidarity cannot be denied or dismissed or delegated to others alone. These issues have become our business. They're everyone's responsibility. When we are part of social change, we can connect with each other at a time when society insists upon compartmentalizing us into silos of identity, thought, political alignment, and geography. When we engage in social change, we resist these silos and we choose connection and solidarity. Together, we can change unfair and unjust systems, share knowledge, celebrate and express joy, and create pathways to sharing power. So I'm going to stop there because I want to get into the conversation, but that's just a little bit from the introduction to set the stage for what I think many of us are moving through right now, and these overlapping crises that we continually are feeling around us. And so this framework gives us a way to kind of think through those. So I will turn it back over to Alex to get us started.
Thanks so much. Well, maybe to start off, can you explain, Deepa, like kind of the components of the framework and like who can use it and how you kind of been using it?
And I think there's some seats up here if folks want to come up. I think this is a good time to pass out the posters. Thank you so much. So we're passing out some posters. I don't know that there's enough for everyone, so you might have to share with someone next to you. And then I'll talk through the components. Before with you all, I grabbed a poster. So just so you know, this framework came together in 2017. During that time, you might remember we were dealing with the Muslim ban, raids on immigrant communities, attacks on transgender community members, and more. So I felt like I was on this seesaw of feeling outraged in the morning and like really numb at night. And I couldn't figure out how to play a role to fit in, even though I'd been part of movements for a while. And so with a lot of reflection around how in times of crisis folks show up and organizations show up, it struck me that there are a couple of ways in which people do that and organizations do that. So first and foremost, this is a multi-dimensional framework. And so this framework can be used by individuals, or it can be used by organizations, and it can also be used by coalitions and networks. So you can really kind of move through it on all of those levels. There are 3 components to it. So if you look in the middle circle, that particular component, the yellow, is focused on our shared values. And those were the ones that I was thinking of when I put this together in 2017. You will have other values for yourselves and the work that you're doing. So it's an opportunity to identify those, but not just to write them down, but to really think through what will the world look like when those values are actually embodied, right? What will it look like if we don't agree around values? How do we move through values alignment and misalignment that always happens in social movements? So once we've kind of identified those shared values, then the second component is to think about our roles. And the ecosystem framework invites us to think about 10 roles that are often played by individuals and organizations to bring about social change. You'll see here that these roles are not job titles, and that we are not looking at them in a hierarchy, right? I'm not going to go through each of these. I think we'll talk about them, but you'll see little definitions of characteristics of these roles next to them. And then third, the entire framework is really about an ecosystem model or approach, and that's the third component. So an ecosystem is any set, this is an ecosystem, right here. But it could be a mutual aid association, a campus group, a nonprofit, philanthropy, a DEI task force, a cultural space. So any sort of place where we feel like there is a possibility to connect and move together. So when we move out of silos and build connections and solidarity, then our ecosystems become a lot more robust. It's a really simple framework, but if you work with it, I think you will find that it brings some profound insights, depending on where you are in your social change journey. But those are the 3 components in the book and other things that we do, trainings, move people through all of those 3 components.
And Cathi, I know you've used this framework in some of your activism. Can you talk about maybe some of that experience and how it's helped you? Or?
Yeah, so I really wish I had Deepa's framework when I was in college, because as I was just sharing just before we got started, a lot of like just deciding where to go, like so many, people just fresh out of undergrad, we don't know our direction. And my starting question was like, what's the most useful thing to do? Which is such a difficult question because everything is useful. I was like going from earth sciences to like physics and then I landed finally in like, okay, well actually it's what do I feel most myself in and aligned with, and that in that you can flourish. Like the phrase of like the natural design of an acorn is to grow into a certain thing. And so it was more of like figuring out what am I fit to do? What am I meant to do? And in that I grow. And I think seeing in the room maybe folks from across the diaspora, a lot of the pressures that we might face, or I'll speak for myself, as like GYOPO, eldest daughter, second gen, is often like, how do I serve others? But I think the question is such an important question, but the starting question I learned, Deepa's framework really helped me understand and crystallize as I was graduating from law school was what is my role? What do I feel most aligned with? How do I feel authentically me? And then through that, how can I best serve my community? Not just how am I responding to the expectations of my elders or people I respect. And so it started very personal. Deepa's framework was a very personal, a journey of, okay, so how do I want to use my law degree or not? And I talked about it with friends, and we used it on a very person-to-person basis. And then I think now in my work as with policy and organizing around the Korean War, being a 70-year and still ongoing war, it feels insurmountable. It feels like you could do a million things, and that, like you just shared, feeling like you should be doing a million things often leaves you feeling like I'll just do nothing. It's just paralyzing. And so I think using this framework to understand, okay, the moment calls for who's my audience right now? Is it a grassroots group of folks all across the country, or is it just LA? Is it the State Department? Is it other policymakers from different sectors of peacemaking work? And understanding the context helps me understand what role I want to play. And I think it's a lot of studying the there's this phrase of intuition is the outgrowth of deep study. So having that sort of personal time with the framework then lets me, in the kind of organizing space and advocacy space, know what role to play. And I think as a concrete example too, this past July we organized around the 70th anniversary of the armistice of the Korean War, and when inviting folks to join, really making it clear a lot of folks I talk to, especially younger folks who want to get involved, are well, I'm not an expert in policy. And it's with 7 years of war, there's so many facts, I'm still learning every day. Add to that linguistic divide, add to that how many different nation states are involved in the Korean Peninsula. It's just so complicated. And I think talking to, especially our 30 under 30 Iris is here in our front row, knowing that your skill as a designer, we're in GYOPO space, your skill as a cultural worker, your skill as a storyteller, we really need that. We can't just all just be, the policy head that is on democracy now. We need folks to be on all spokes of the wheel. So I think your wheel was so empowering for so many people to understand, if you feel disaffected with Congress, if you feel disaffected, if you feel kind of, I have no interest in really engaging, there's other ways to support and to be involved and to support those who do feel interested in engaging. So yeah, it's been a very powerful framework for me personally and for the work.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
Is there is that a common thing that you hear when you work with organizations that have adopted your framework kind of at a later stage in life or at a later stage in the organization, or?
I think that folks come to it at different stages. The framework, can be used in lots of different ways. So organizations sometimes use it to map their staff to see kind of what roles do staff play in our organization to advance our shared values. And there will be some insights. I was recently working with an organization where it ended up that there was a pretty gendered response where the visionaries, which tend to be the more visible spokespersons, are the ones that inspire us and say, this is the North Star, this is where we're going, tended to be male identified, and folks who map themselves as builders, who are kind of creating the scaffolding of the programming, the events, right? Saw themselves as builders or caregivers, creating a community of care and joy within the organization. And that was actually revealing to the organization's leadership, because that kind of gendered identification enabled them to think about how to shift in terms of the different roles for staff, right? Or another example is philanthropic organizations often use the framework to map out their grantees in a particular portfolio And so what you often can find is that there are gaps, right? And so if I recently worked with an organization that works with education justice grantees around the country, and when they mapped their grantees out, they found that there were a lot of disruptors who are the folks that get into necessary good trouble, like Representative John Lewis asked us to do. There were a lot of folks who were frontline responders, who are the folks who are immediately responsive in times of crisis and emergency. They know how to organize people, et cetera. But what they didn't have were storytellers. So they weren't able to convey what was happening around education justice to the general public. And this happens a lot in movements because we're so internally focused that we're not actually sharing the message out to the general public, right? And so how do we adopt, if we're even working on a campaign, how do we try to make sure, we don't have to fill every role on this map, but how do we try to make sure that we do have organizations or individuals who are playing these various roles? A role that's usually not played is the role of a healer. And I always think in social justice work where we're actually tending to harm, we're trying to repair a divide, it's so important to have healers, right? So that healers are folks who are really thinking about generational trauma and how it winds itself through our communities or organizations, and they're using practices like somatic healing or breath work or restorative justice, community circle, right? We want to bring those folks in when we have a conflict. But what would it be like if we actually included those folks from the beginning to set the container of how we actually deal with conflict? What happens when we disagree? What are our guiding principles, right? So that's an example of how even in a campaign, if we can just pause and breathe and align ourselves around this, it can actually be super, super helpful.
I mean, that's a good segue into our current situation. So, I mean, I know for me personally, just kind of watching what's happening in Gaza, just like I don't know what to do. You know, like I just felt frozen. Like on social media, I'm an artist, so like if you're in the art world, you've seen the art world just like eating itself, right? Like just like can't really, you know, people are getting blocked left and right, and just like it's just unbelievable. But then if you go on Deepa's Instagram, not to you know be like super fanboy or anything, but she just posted, you know, this very, you know, really meaningful post about like, okay, well, what can you do right now? And then she kind of breaks down different things you could do sort of according to the framework. And like I saw that and I was like, wow, it's like it felt like I could breathe again. It's like, okay, like I can take a breath and I can figure out a way to engage with this huge, like terrible thing that's like way beyond the understanding or capability of one person to fix. So like, I guess like how do you think we can use this framework, you know, to when there's something like urgent, like a huge crisis, like a huge like breaking point? Yes,
I would love for you to
Okay.
go first. I'm such a good,
So my hope is that we use this framework and frameworks like it, not just in moments of crisis, but generally to prep. But unfortunately, I think it gets used most in times of crisis because we don't often know what to do and we're really overwhelmed. There's so much information and there's so many voices. So I think one of the first things to do, which I haven't talked about, is really to figure out who is your ecosystem, and right, who are the voices and communities that you want to center or be in service to. That's really important, and there could be multiple communities, right? You started off talking when you had the moment of silence. You mentioned everybody who's suffering, Israelis, Palestinians. You talked about the root causes of occupation, and also what is happening here in this country as a result of the genocide happening in Gaza. And so part of it is like when we think about our ecosystem and who we want to be connected to, we want to really identify that. And so in this moment, I think folks are playing lots of different roles, and we could. So one role that I see a lot is the role of the weaver. So what that means is, and I know you'll talk about this too a little bit, is that we are making connections we're connecting the dots between issues and communities that seem very discrete and separate, because we see the threads, right? So for example, where I've noticed Black communities are having conversations about what does Palestine mean to Black people, right? To build the thread of what does occupation mean, or what does abolition mean when you are also thinking about occupation in Palestine. I saw a group of Filipino American youth talk about the impact of militarism and war in the Philippines and how that's connected, right? So Weavers can do that kind of work to make those connections. So if you're a part of an organization that works in a different community, you might want to think about, well, how can we build some solidarity or support right now? What are the threads that connect our communities with Jewish and Palestinian communities, for example? I've also seen folks doing frontline response. So that could be everything from going out on the streets, right, to protest, like Students for Justice in Palestine have been leading a lot of those protests. I believe there was one in LA just yesterday that was really big. Or folks can call Congress and make a call to Congress, right, about the ceasefire resolution that was introduced today. That's something that you could organize your community to do as frontline responders. It seems small, but it's not, because it's something that when we're doing it, we're taking a step, and we're not, like you said, just paralyzed by inaction. And then I'm also seeing healers. I recently saw a friend of mine who's a Jewish somatic healer talk about how she's doing healing sessions with Jews who are against the occupation, but need a space to come together, right? And so that's an example of the healing work. So it depends, and you said this earlier, like what are our skills, what are my skills, or what are my organization skills? What are the ecosystems that I want to connect to or bring along? And what is the role that I can play? And how is that connected to all of the other roles?
Yeah, I think that it's the way that I've been processing and also showing up in the past few days. Again, I'm so grateful for the framework because I think knowing that, I think it's really helpful to start with the idea of positionality, and knowing that born in the United States, U.S. citizen, living in Los Angeles, and so currently we're in Congressional District 34. So if you're in this district, your representative is Jimmy Gomez, and Jimmy Gomez. I actually don't, so the ceasefire resolution, I don't know if he said that was just introduced today. He was not among those that introduced, and I'm not sure if he signed on, but I also know he has not signed on to the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act, which has been introduced in a few different versions since 2019, and since 2019, organizers and activists have advocated to have him sign on. The Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act, just in very brief, calls for peace agreement to replace the ceasefire that has been in place for 70 years. It's the 70th year this year. So that's kind of where I start, and I think from that I feel very centered in knowing that, because I think for Korean Americans, or for me specifically, there's a sense of why are you involved on with work on Korea? What's your connection? And I think the GYOPO experience of being disconnected physically from the homeland, there's this question of why am I advocating for what's happening over there? And if I do decide to advocate, what am I advocating for? Am I advocating for reunification? Am I advocating for ending the war drills that are happening incessantly? Am I advocating for family reunions? And I think knowing my position and power and just the resources I have at my very disposal right now, which is being a U.S. citizen, having voting power, being fluent in English, having some amount of legal training. It's I think that's where I come from to then decide what role to play, and I think that ties into also just today actually with the ceasefire resolution, our organization, Women Across DMZ, signed on to be a co-sponsor in solidarity of that resolution. So the resolution calling for a ceasefire, which is, again, so important now in a specific moment when just a few days ago there was that memo that circulated around the State Department that urged to not use language around de-escalation, to not use language around the ceasefire. And a week ago, every single Congress member except for 11, so including Jimmy Gomez, every single Congress member signed on to a House resolution that named, that they were going to, the affirmation of U.S. support for Israeli military aid and the lamenting the loss of Israeli life, which is so important, but not the lamenting the loss of Palestinian life and naming the occupation and naming the genocide. And so there's a very specific role I think GYOPOs can play, Koreans can play in thinking about Palestinian liberation and Palestinian solidarity. And so I think that's what's been really informing my thoughts in processing this week.
I know in your work, Cathi, you have to you're sort of working kind of across generations, and you're also working across varying sort of levels of language ability in both Korean and English. Has there been ways that this framework has been helpful, or I'd love to hear from you too, Deepa, if there's ways that you've seen that your framework can be helpful in sort of crossing generational language and I guess even cultural divides, almost like if you're born here or not born here.
Okay. Well, actually, I think looking at this, the healer, storyteller, weaver, I think that has been so important in our work. I mean, what you said about healing not necessarily being prioritized in a lot of nonprofit ecosystems. This past July in DC, one thing that our organizing group very intentionally did was to have a healing circle that was more inward facing to proceed right before our big public action of going to the White House protest and marching to the Lincoln Memorial. And I think for a lot of folks, the feedback we got was we haven't experienced this in a social, in a mobilization like that. I think there's this idea of we have to disrupt, we have to be public facing, but I mean the Korean War has been ongoing for 73 years. I won't get into all the numbers of the trauma and because it's a lot and it's really heavy, but we need to have the space to unpack that. And I think that's what's so beautiful about GYOPO is we use cultural work and we use art as a medium to get at these things that pure policy, pure numbers, and pure arguments can't get at. And so we actually had a artist, Do-hee Lee, lead us through song and movement, and we literally untied ribbons, drawing from rituals from Korea of untying your grief, untying your rage, and also a lot of expelling using our voices and our bodies. And I think everyone then felt okay, I have breath, I have my body, and we literally went out and we as people say about direct action, voting with our bodies. And I think that was so important to ground us. And we had in that room Korean speakers, full monolingual Korean speakers, monolingual English speakers across generations, and it was the song and the color and the texture, that sensory experience that I think really brought us together. And then we were in DC marching and stopping traffic. So it was, yeah, exactly. We needed to go through those two things.
In order to disrupt.
Exactly, yeah.
Maybe I'll answer the next question that I know is coming, and then because we're going to turn it over to the audience. Okay, yeah. Do you want to ask it? Because that way, because I feel like I can't say anything else.
Is this the different roles one? Yeah, so I guess the next question that we did not script at all is how do you kind of manage sustainability as you move through different roles or as you shift?
Yeah, we're all builders, so of course we're going to prep and have a script. So yeah. So I guess I want to say a couple of things about this if you look at this. One of the things is that these roles are complementary in many ways, right? So, for example, visionaries can't really do their work without builders and experimenters. And so when you're even part of a team or a staff or a campaign, it's important to understand the connections between these. Disruptors and frontline responders really need caregivers and healers to support their ongoing work. Storytellers and visionaries are important combinations, right? So because storytellers can make the vision something that folks will understand through different mediums. So one of the things around sustainability, but also working across generation, is we are all overwhelmed and fatigued all the time, right? Like this moment requires a lot from us, and we are all exhausted, and I think it's okay to say that. I didn't say that for a long time because I felt like I had to push through it because I held privilege in many ways, right? And so I felt like it wasn't possible for me to talk about the impact of doing social change work, either the direct or vicarious trauma of it, because there were so many people who were directly affected in significant ways. And I've learned slowly to understand that it is okay to say that, because it allows me to accept that guilt a little bit and then let it go. And I loved what you talked about with the untying and the release. So part of this framework is that we can shift our role depending on our capacity and our context. And so for me, I played the role of a frontline responder for like 15 years after 9/11. And at the end of that, I realized that I was numb and I could not even respond to a community crisis anymore because it was up here, like I was up here with it. And I could not get into my heart space at all. But I love the work I do, and I love the people that I work with in community, and I did not want to leave. And a lot of times that's what you're asked to do. You have to like leave, right? You have to leave the community, you have to leave the work so you can get better and get healthy, etc. So this framework can offer a reset because it enables us to find a different role. So I have moved a little bit grudgingly, because I love being a frontline responder. That is a hard one to lead, to the role of a guide to support other frontline responders. And so, I take that very seriously, to like whether it's to facilitate conversations that other frontline responders are having, or to provide support, or to check in on people, or to write about what I just said, the trauma, so that when I say it, it's okay for others to also be able to say it. So playing the role of a guide. So it allows us to think about a different kind of role that we want to show up in, and that is, I think, what's related to sustainability and capacity. Because we cannot and should not be playing all the roles. So if you look at this and you're like, oh, I do like 7 out of 10 of that, it should be like a little bit of an alarm bell, because it's likely that you might not be as effective as you think, right? And saying that it's okay to cycle through different ones, and depending on the context, you might, right? So that's why it's so important, as you said, like thinking about what is the context, who is the ecosystem or the audience, what are the skills that we can offer, I can offer, what will be in service to our shared values. So going through that process, which is really hard to do if there is a crisis, but if we take a little bit of a breather and step back and go through it, I think we show up way more effectively. Because we need to win, right? And we need to take care of our community. And I think it allows us to do that a little bit. And I usually actually use this, like before meetings, I actually think, what am I gonna show up as in this meeting or on this call? And then I set my boundaries according to that. So I don't try to do all of it, which I want to tend to do most of the time. Yeah.
That's really great too, because it allows you to stay within the same organizational ecosystem instead of like, you know, what I see happen a lot is like somebody will get burnt out and then they leave, and then it happens again at a different place, and then they leave there, and then the organization never gets, or that ecosystem or organization never gets to really grow and mature beyond the first like several years or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we'd love to open it up to you all. So if you have any questions or comments, we can continue the conversation for a few minutes.
Deepa, I love this, and I followed your work for a long time. Is there anything you would say, if I would add one, or like, is there something that in the years since you initially, like, that you're like, ooh, if I made it, I'm sure it's something that could never stop, but I think what you provided here is amazing, and it's like the foundational things, but I'm sure after you do it, you're like, oh, what about this?
Yeah. Thanks, Stephanie. Well, I tend to try to be a little bit of an experimenter at times, which means we put stuff out when it's not perfect and we see what the world wants to do with it. So, I have not, to be honest, but others have, and that's great. I think I often say, feel free to add roles that suit you, but just don't make them job titles. So a lot of folks will say, well, what about organizers? And it's like, you could be an organizer in so many, right? You could be a frontline responder organizer, you could be an organizer of resources like funding and be a weaver in that way. So just as long as it's not like a job title, or someone I think the other day was asking, well, what about researchers? And I was like, yeah, researchers are storytellers actually. So you take your data and your anecdotes and you're actually telling a story or a trend or a theme. Not to say that you have to, so I have not, but I think others have, and I think that's great. Like the part of this framework is that it's adaptable for your use, right? It's just an offering, so people have built on it, and people have used it like at staff retreats for strategic planning. They've used it to figure out how to put their vision and mission statement out on their websites. They've used it to set a campaign to say, in this campaign, we are going to show up as healers or whatever, right, to be really clear. They've used it to raise money, to say, we're going to be focusing on our role as guides for the next 2 years, and that's what we're raising money around. So I think folks use it in lots of different ways. I appreciate the question, and it's totally adaptable. Yeah.
I have a question. It's sort of related to all this, but I think I've just been in like panic mode for like the last 4 years and obsessing about emergency preparedness and everything.
Yeah.
And so something that actually has helped me is Saeed Jones' most recent poetry book is called Alive at the End of the World. And the description of the book says something about the end of the world is already here and the apocalypse is a state of being. And when I read that, it actually made me calm down. So like and I've been offline a lot, so I have not been as connected to what's happening in the last week and just kind of coming back into the real world now. But it's like, when I see these things happening, it's kind of like, oh, that's because it's the end of the world. We're living in the end of the world. But I'm curious like what you all think about that. And anybody in the audience too. It's just, it has actually helped me because it's like, oh, now it's just about like making ourselves comfortable as possible and helping each other. But I don't know if that's really useful, but it's helped me. And I'm really curious like what other people think about that, because I just haven't talked with others. And I think it's like, it's almost like, why would we want now to be the end of the world, But yet for me, it was very weirdly like comforting in a weird way.
Yeah, I think maybe the comfort, it reminds me of like, the Arundhati Roy essay, like a pandemic is the portal. And that, I think it might be comforting, and like I've heard this from a few people this week actually. Of course, not in the way of like, there's so much suffering. But I think that idea is like, we can stop worrying about like, what are we gonna slide into and just start building something in this moment, knowing that there's nothing to do other than shift the paradigm here. And like that we can kind of stop expending our mental and emotional energy on like preoccupation with anxiety, but it just kind of it's like you're a little more clear-eyed. You're going from a place of like, just I want to build as opposed to like what's going to happen, like less frenetic. And I mean, I think this comes up a lot. You know, today the U.S. landed like a B-52 like plane, which they haven't done in decades. Like a nuclear powered submarine a few months ago. Every day there's some crisis. You can frame like why you need to now the time to support Korea, and I think that's where solidarity building comes in. It's like it's understanding that the crisis is part. We can take it because we're building this vision of like trans-Pacific demilitarization. We're thinking about the framework of that the U.S. military and is like one of the biggest greenhouse polluters in the world. Like it's just we understand the scale of which we're dealing with. The crisis is it's a crisis, but it comes as no surprise in some ways. And so when we know that we're building something that is meeting the scale of what is happening, we understand how we can respond to the crisis. And so I think in that, like thinking about how to respond in solidarity with those who are fighting, especially those who are fighting right now, for individuals in Palestine, it's like that's why it was so clear that what we are doing at our organization is we will uplift like the ceasefire call in solidarity with a group of organizations, and we already have those relationships because we're in a social change ecosystem with all of those different organizations doing that work. It's still tricky, and it definitely there's like crisis feeling moments, but I think that's kind of this feeling of like not feeling so like reactionary and just more like I have my long-term thing that I'm working on, and I know how to deal with these like unexpected crises in that moment.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I agree with everything you said. I think that I want to validate what you're feeling. I think that many of us feel that way, right? And I think that part of it is to not be reactive and not be paralyzed. Like those are, I think, the extremes of feeling that way, to like completely just accept it and be apathetic and not know what to do, or to be, as you say, like chaotic in terms of a response. I often think I have a 13-year-old son, and so at one level I won't ever accept that it is the end of the world, but another part of me also wrestles with that all the time, and so I live in that kind of liminal place. But it really just go back to thinking about, for me anyway, what are some small steps I can take in order to understand what we can still build and preserve. And so that's really, at the end of the day, the question. So what do we protect and preserve? And what do we just give up, right, and release, because it's just not that important? And what is it that we are going to build towards? And solidarity is, I think, a wonderful way of thinking about that.
Any other questions or comments?
Oh yeah, I think in general, I also have a law background and then went into art, and so my decision to go into art now is because all of those academic disciplines and those kinds of like places where categories are so important to me just seem to fail me. But I think also within art there's so many politics, and there's people. I think it's really fascinating in LA, especially where there's lots of these kind of grants that are time limited, like one of them that I received where you're kind of paired with a nonprofit and you're trying to create like an artwork that supports social change, but there's so little awareness of like, or even whether it's the artist or the organization, there's like really like a lack of understanding as to what the role of the artist is, and are they, as a storyteller, are they just facilitating a conversation? Are they actually finding new ways to think about data collection? Are they like, what's their skill set? Because I've noticed a lot of socially engaged projects are just artists kind of like, it's a very kind of, they don't want to like act like they have any expertise. It's like, oh, just come and talk about your story. It's like very facilitation oriented and not very much like, I have a framework that I'm trying to provide. But I think, I don't know why I live with that, but I think like that's something I'm dealing with now is kind of trying to understand my role as an artist with this organization, and also my role as a certain kind of representative of a certain kind of minority versus like, you know, there's like white people and all the other POCs, but then within minority communities, there's like Asian versus Pacific Islander and, you know, that dynamic, and so that I'm kind of dealing with that. But I think, I guess that's like, I don't know, that's just a comment. But I guess one of my more specific questions is, a lot of these conflicts have to do with humans' relationship to land and drawing lines between nations and things like that. And I think, like, to me, on a certain level, the kind of who got there first and then who came in as an occupier or colonizer, and kind of trying to trace all that and to go back to like, well, the people who were there first should get X, Y, Z. It's still within the logic of like a certain relationship to land that maybe is still kind of tied to a nation state mentality. And I don't know if, I almost feel like I wish we could just ask the dirt, like, what do you want from us? Like, do you even want these nations? Or like, and I feel like almost as an artist, maybe we have an opportunity to try to pose these kinds of questions completely outside of like disputes around, well, where's the injustice? But I don't know if you've thought about like land, people's relationship to land and nations per se, or like, I don't know.
Okay. Well, actually, I just came from yesterday a workshop with Dohee Lee, the artist I mentioned up in the Bay, and she was facilitating a workshop called Body is Land. And it's a 4-part workshop with Asian Refugees United, and called like Connect, Reflect, and Act, and thinking about how, you know, like she walked through like all the spinal and like and the lumbar and the psoas, and thinking about that in connection to the landscape around us. And the ending of our workshop was actually like an offering, like all of us in a circle made an offering in the center around like, I need earth to X, I need water to Y. And your reflection also reminds me of Robin Wall Kimmerer, the indigenous writer who writes about in Braiding Sweetgrass, says like, thinking about, I'm gonna not get the quote correct, but thinking about water and wind that know no allegiance to any nation state and no boundaries. And so I think like going back a little to what you were saying earlier of like the somatic work and knowing our bodies, I think, and spending that time with the soil and with land and getting answers from that, and complicating our ideas around what is allegiance. And especially for folks who are disconnected from where their ancestors were so tied to maybe one specific land, it's especially important work that I'm in continual process of learning and unlearning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd love to hear if others have any responses. I mean, I think self-determination and the ability to be on one's land, I think about it so much with what's happening in Gaza right now, and I think they're really important questions to consider. And oftentimes, as you say, it is actually the cultural workers and the artists and the storytellers who can pose those questions and reflections in ways that maybe folks are not thinking about, because social change in some ways is very linear. You know, we're like, okay, we have these targets, we have this goal, and we're gonna use this strategy to get there. It's a survival tactic at times, because we have to, you know, we feel like we're in this state of apocalypse or whatever, so we're trying to survive. So I think a lot of the cultural workers or artists that I've encountered that are part of social change are posing these questions in a different way. Oftentimes they really are, yes, they're storytellers, but they're really experimenters, because they are trying to show us a different way of thinking about the issues that we are concerned with. They're reflecting back, you know, a lot of the questions that maybe we're not aware of, that are more in the heart space or the body space. And so, but the thing that I have learned, and it's actually something in the book, there's an artist story that I talk about who's an experimenter, and she's part of a social justice organization. Part of what is a lesson learned from that story is she talks about how the incubator has to be one that allows for experimentation. Otherwise, I think a lot of cultural workers or artists are pushing against an organization's way of doing things. And so having the conversation about like, is this space a place where I can bring up new ideas and it'll be considered, right? Like how much leeway and breadth do I have? So having those conversations up front, if that's possible, can make it a little bit easier, I think, to experiment inside an incubator space. Should we?
Yeah. So I think we're gonna, thanks everyone, I think we're gonna move to a little workshop now, so I'm gonna hand it over
Yeah,
to Deepa.
it's gonna be very short, don't worry, it won't be hard. Okay, so we just wanted to give you all a chance to like map yourselves on this framework, right? And so if you don't have a poster of your own, you can share with a neighbor. And we're gonna pass out some dots. So sometimes people are like, no, I will not use the dots and put them on the poster because I want to save the poster and that which you should do and can't do. It's up to you. Some others will write all over it, so it just depends on who you are. So what I'd love for you to do, and this goes back to something Cathi said, which is doing some personal reflection, right? Thinking about oneself first. So I'd love for you to, you've already done this in your head, I know, during this conversation you were doing it. I want you to, one, choose an ecosystem, right? So it could be GYOPO, it could be your volunteer organization, it could be where you work, it could be your neighborhood. Choose an ecosystem that you're connected to, okay? And then I want you to identify 2 roles that you show up in that ecosystem. And a couple of examples of that, right? If you're like, you know what, I show up in these 2 roles, but I aspire to do something else, think about that. Or if you don't know, and if you don't have a role, think about what you'd like to show up as based on your skill sets and your lived experiences, okay? So we're gonna take a couple of moments in silence. 1, what ecosystem are you thinking of? 2, what are the 2 roles that you show up as or aspire to show up as? And why? What are some examples, okay? And then we're gonna do a pair share so you know what's next. So you're gonna talk to your neighbor, okay?
Oh, the pears? Yeah.
I love that y'all are talking. Thank you. I would love to have some thoughts in terms of like what came up in your conversations, what were some themes or questions that came up, any insights folks want to share? I can call on people. I see like some of my favorite people back there are Favora and Angela O. Okay, I'm not, can I? Sure. Thanks.
Hi
Thanks.
everyone. I mentioned kind of what I do by day, so I mentioned that my ecosystem is the space in which I work, which is to actually tell stories and educate folks about like the land and its connectivity to people and healing through composting in LA. So I tell actually, so in that way I'm able to actually tell stories and share data, and then also to be able to build systems and connectivity across different departments, but also with our partners. And then I feel like eventually I'm kind of building those, planting those seeds right now, but eventually we'll become a weaver in terms of the connectivity externally, out in the community and with partners and then internally in terms of really building bridges to not necessarily just being a monetary resource, but how people can really get involved and see this kind of full circle of their organics and the land and disposing of things responsibly to then receiving those fresh fruits and vegetables, especially for under-resourced communities, and then building connectivity to each other and telling those stories.
So I know Arfa, and I know she's a weaver because she's always been a weaver, connector. But I also love what you said because you were talking about yourself, but also the organization. And so I think sometimes we can also look at this in that way. Like I might be bringing certain skill sets to an organization, and how, does the organization also see itself in that way, right? That's where there's a sweet spot when we can, our team and our staff are doing the same types of roles that the organization seeks to do in the world too. Angela, did you want to share?
Sure.
If you don't,
I'm sorry about the mask.
No.
I have elderly parents, so I need to.
Please, no apologies.
So, the ecosystem I chose was a nonprofit that I serve on the board of. So our tagline is healing people and healing the planet. It's been that for 48 years. And right now, the roles are guide, because I've done a lot of different things. And right now, my main contribution is really the wisdom from all of the things that I've seen and done, mistakes I've made, enemies and friends I've made. Caregiver also, because right now my one of my side gigs or hustles is that I'm a wellness coach for people that are in this space of social change, but I don't do it as a matter of just coaching an individual. I'm trying to create sacred hospitality spaces. So we are living in a time of global polycrisis and collapse of civilizations worldwide. So the evidence of it is what we're experiencing now, which means we have to work really positively to bring joy, compassion, and caring and kindness forward.
I always appreciate your wisdom and guidance. Thank you so much. Anyone else want to share some thoughts? You don't have to share your roles, you can share thoughts or whatever came up for you.
Yeah,
And
so
tell us your name.
my name's Erica. So I was thinking when I first saw it and when I was sharing, like, I feel like I am one of those people that's like 8 of these or
Yeah.
all of these, and I was kind of unpacking it as you were talking and thinking about kind of why that is, and I think so many, like, kind of what you added on, the idea like being able to ask the question is wonderful and also probably a privilege. And so I think that, you know, in many cases, those of us that work in nonprofits, and I work in a very large LA-based nonprofit, we're forced by the nonprofit industrial complex to really take on all of these roles.
Yeah.
And that's not a choice or a matter of boundaries or something that I'm not committed to personally, right? But so much of it is wrapped up in something so much larger, and it's so much harder. And so, you know, and I think a lot about like a lot of the frontline workers that we employ, right? Like we need to be there, right? The nonprofit, so for me, just saying like, oh, I'm not gonna do that, I'm not gonna co-sign that, you know, I think that I need to be there because people like me need to be able to disrupt within this system.
Yes.
And within this social change organization that's committed to it, but is struggling and grappling and playing this dance with, you know, these larger structures, right? Like we have government funders, and if we don't do what the government funders want, which is taking all these roles, then we lose the funding, and that has real life impact on the staff that we employ, for example. And so I think, you know, that's kind of just some of what our conversation ended on was, you know, I think that I love this and I'm committed to this, and also
It's not easy to do.
this is not me.
No,
And-
I actually appreciate you saying that, because in most nonprofits, like, we don't get the privilege of saying, oh, I found my role, right, and it works, because as a former ED myself, like, I played every role on that particular framework, and felt like I wasn't very effective, but I had to, because I think a lot of organizations are sitting on this kind of pressure cooker where it feels like you have to kind of compete for resources, you have to produce all the time, right, in order to not just get funding, but to do the work. So I absolutely agree with you, which is why I think it's a challenge. This framework is a challenge for a lot of nonprofits that we train, because they say, well, we're not ready to stop and pause or make some of these shifts. Or they'll say, we've done this the same way all the time. So it's not an easy framework to it. I think some people find it easy on a personal level, but I think from a structural standpoint, it really depends on your organization. So I appreciate you saying that. it's an intervention. It's a disruptive framework for some. And trust me, I've sat in rooms with executive directors who have looked at me and said, please don't talk about this framework to our staff, right? But then others have said, other folks will say introduce it, because that's the only way that things will shift. So I totally respect what you're saying. I don't think it's an easy one. I will say that right now, I think that social change organizations are going through this point of inflection about who they are and how they're going to show up, and I think it's an important conversation to be having.
Yeah, not to, but I think just like I was, yes, and also it's not even necessarily the will. Like, I think that as an agency, I'm pretty high up in the, we have the will, but we don't have, if we, say F you to LA County, right? Like, we lose funding and that has real impact, right? And so I think that so much of it is this nonprofit industrial complex that's putting us in this position. It's not even that we don't want it, because I think we're a whole community of people that want it, but it's that really delicate dance.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I put a lot of blame on philanthropy.
Deepa, can I ask you a follow-up question? Like, have you ever had an experience like using this framework as part of the onboarding process or as part of the beginning of an organization?
Oh,
you know what I mean? Like, because I just wonder what that would look like. It feels like if you built an organization from the start, like with this as the onboarding process, with this as like part of the beginning, like I feel like that would look very different than like a really old nonprofit, like just trying to jam this into
change
this
its
thing.
entrenched model. So during the 2020 uprisings, a lot of new nonprofits, as you know, were birthed, right, to respond to the crisis or during the pandemic. And so there have been like some mutual aid associations and collectives that have utilized this framework to organize themselves. Whether or not they'll stick with that, I don't know, but I know that in those moments, there have been folks who have done that. And I also think what Erica, right, is saying is super real, because it's not, you're trying to push against a system that doesn't actually want to believe in an ecosystem model, right? So what would it look like if LA County was part of the ecosystem? It's really the question for me that comes up, because if they are, if we all care, right, about like the same values and want the same things, then what would it look like for them to maybe play the role of a builder or a lever, like organizing resources, right? But doing so along with everyone else. And that's a big shift.
Yeah.
That's a shift I don't know. I don't know how long this kind of shift will take.
We're in apocalypse.
Anyone else? Anything to add or thoughts that are coming up? Yeah.
I'll share that I really appreciated this exercise because I had a lot of trouble thinking about like what my ecosystem was. Like I kind of was like, how do I fit, and do I have an ecosystem?
Yeah.
And I think I was also sort of rendering an ecosystem as like a very busy place with lots of people, and I think what ended up happening after this exercise was I kind of reimagined an ecosystem also as like my patterns of thinking, or like more quieter spaces, like relationships with other people, and that felt really important.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for saying that, because you might have touched upon something that other people feel too. But our ecosystem could be like literally, it doesn't have to be a ton of people. It can be a small community, or it could be our family or a chosen family, right? There are lots of different ecosystems that I think we are in connection with. Yeah.
I just wanted to say I just so appreciate this event and the work that you have been doing in this framework, because I think particularly in like times like this, social media makes us believe that if you're not a first responder, you're a bad person. And I think seeing it mapped out in this way where everybody is on equal contribution, and that kind of combining the feeling of like this is the end of the world, and so the time is now, but like not in a way that like you feel scarce about time, but that like we need to be building in a way that's not just like how do we solve this problem that's in front of us right now, but like to understand that this is a problem that has been a problem for generations and generations and generations, and like the role that you have and that you are already doing, you are doing the work. And so I just really appreciate that. Yeah.
And I love your idea of abundance and thinking about, you know, like the abundance of community, the abundance of wisdom, knowledge that we can bring to these conversations, even when it feels like it's urgent or we're sitting on this pressure cooker. And yes, we don't have to all be the first visible frontline responders. There are others who will do that, which is great.
Yeah.
But it's okay to take a breath and think about, like, how can we show up in a way that's supportive of communities who need to be centered. So I often think about during the uprisings in 2020, a lot of folks use this framework to say, like, I can't be on the streets to protest as a frontline responder because of the pandemic, right? And so instead, folks were caregivers to the frontline responders, like making sure they had water and food, or giving their phone numbers so that if a frontline responder was arrested, the caregiver would be called, right? So there are different ways to still support, even if we're not like on the visible front lines or something.
Some of the themes that emerged was just like it's echoing what you said, just gratitude for this event and seeing the emergence of how and militarism and the land there was a weaving of the Korean American struggle and the Palestinian struggle, and to see it come alive and emerge in this space where I was like, how do we build transnational solidarity, and then to feel it palpably in this space was such a gift. And then in my conversation with Nami, we were talking about like, yes, our work as a physician and veterinarian, or, you know, we fall into our like roles very easy as frontline responders and caregivers and healers. And then I really struggled to even put my sticker next to guide, because I was like, you know, there's like a sense of like to have humility and not to like name your strength, and to and she was like, no, be brave, like put that sticker there. And you know, there's like the shared cultural theme of like put your head down, don't look anyone in the eye, how to step forward. And so talking to her made me feel braver, so thank you.
That's so great. Thank you. Thank you for saying that. I feel like that's a great thing. I don't know if there's that was great, and I love that. I love that there can be that kind of solidarity and building, and I'm so grateful to GYOPO for this space that you all have created. It's amazing. It's remarkable. I walked in here and I was like, oh, I wish there was something like this where I live in DC, because it is an ecosystem of connectedness and community, and we can find these surprising moments of solidarity emerge, right, where we didn't think it was possible, and I think it gives us hope to keep kind of moving to the next step.
Any final calls to action or comments from the both of you?
Well, I will say, I think I saw this phrase once from a colleague, and he's like, in the way that moves you. And so the calls to a very easy, like tangible call to action I'll share is like, as Deepa mentioned, there is a resolution that's been introduced by Representative Cori Bush and others naming, calling for a ceasefire. And I think in this moment, that feels very important and urgent. And also, you know, in keeping with this, there's probably calls to action that have not even been thought of, that I could not think about, but that you are particularly suited to think about. And so I'm actually excited to see what emerges. Yeah, and that I think if there is a call to action, I'd share it, which I will also be doing, is like to kind of take the moment to just check in with myself and see what feels right in this moment. And yeah, I think that's what I'd share. What about you?
Yeah, no, that's great. I do think that those kinds of things, like making a call to a member of Congress, is very important and part of the broader ecosystem. Gosh, I think honestly, I'm just grateful that you all came here and shared and were vulnerable and open. I think my only call to action is just to think about deepening, you know, whatever role you identified yourself as, to think about a step to deepen that, whatever that means for you as a human, and to do that with a sense of power, but also to tend to what feels like a very important an urgent moment. So whatever that is, that's, you know, your own personal piece. But I hope and invite us all to think about how we can deepen and strengthen our roles.
Well, thank you very much. So I'm gonna take on the role of salesperson / cheerleader. That's not on there, but we have some of Deepa's books for sale. And if you like this format, I think you'll really like the book because it's actually a workbook. There's lots of questions for reflection. And Deepa ran like a workshop for another organization I'm involved with, which was really fruitful and interesting. So there's some books available. We can all share some kimbap and drink a little bit and hopefully continue the conversation, and Deepa will be around to sign books.
Happy to sign books and talk and meet you all. I was just going to say quickly that if you're interested in digging into this, obviously the book is an option. It is a journal, because I love a good journal. So there's lots of prompts. And Julie Cho, who's kind of associated with GYOPO, is one of the people who designed this book, so I loved it. There's that LA connection. But there's lots of questions and like your turn and lots of places where you can write. But the book is one thing. If you do purchase the book, all of the proceeds I'm going to be donating to Palestine Legal, which is a nonprofit that is supporting people who are being doxxed or silenced when they speak up in this moment, to do legal representation for them. But if you're not interested in the book, there's plenty of stuff available on socialchangemap.com, which is the website that's on the poster. And our organization, the organization I work at, Building Movement Project, we do trainings and workshops on this framework, 90 minutes. So if you are interested in that for your organization, please feel free to reach out and we can organize something with you on Zoom, virtually. Because you can't come to LA all the time. No, I wish I could. So hope to meet you in person, and thank you again for being here. Thank you so much, Alex, because he actually made this whole thing happen. And appreciate the GYOPO volunteers, our ASL. Thank you so much for being here and staying for us.